Hello, I'm Dr. Torna Pitman. I work for Gender Equality, a Tasmanian statewide family violence service. Welcome to video 9 of our coercive control series. Today we're talking about the post-separation challenges and consequences created by coercive control, which are considerable. So even though a victim of coercive control, and statistically that is invariably a woman, and particularly with a woman with children, leaving a coercive controller just heralds a post-separation version of coercive control. So when we say to women, why do you stay? Why don't you just leave? Especially when they have children, what we don't often understand is that for them, post-separation brings about a whole other set of problems upon which they have to work without being able to heal what happened to them pre-separation. So it's a really complex scenario post-separation after living with a coercive controller when you have children with that coercive controller. So as we've seen in the previous 8 videos, a coercive controller creates a lot of damage and trauma for the partner as well as for the children. The children are directly and indirectly abused by the coercive controller, as well as experiencing the control patterns in the house, how the house is to run, what kind of freedoms they have, what aren't they allowed to do, power parenting, which is very forceful. It may never include any physical violence, or it may. It may never include any sexual abuse or coercion or assault, but it may. But the thing about coercive control is that it sets up a family life which is unequal, unhealthy, traumatizing, and it reduces the lives of the victims to second-class citizenship. So the decline in living standards and the level of trauma that people experience when they're coercively controlled doesn't just go away because the victim is left by the coercive controller, or the victim ends the relationship or leaves the relationship or actually flees it. It simply heralds the post-separation version of coercive control. So stay tuned for an exploration of the post-separation challenges and consequences for women and children created by coercive control. Back again. So today I'm going to take you through this PowerPoint on the post-separation consequences and challenges created by coercive control. And we start by looking at the schedule. As you can see, we're up to the second last week. We've covered the introduction, the dynamics, the tactics, the styles, the effects, the stages, the children, and now the post-separation consequences and challenges created by coercive control. And next week, the transformation, healing, and recovery from coercive control. The outline for today is that I'll be revisiting conversational control, verbal abuse, and emotional abuse, and then discussing psychological abuse, as those are the core of coercive control. And when we understand the different ways that that can present, we can see that even without going anywhere near physical violence or any major incident or episode, we can see that the family life of living with a coercive controller, or whether you're single or in a family, are going to have incredible consequences and ramifications. And then I'll be going into the legacy of coercive control for the non-offending parent, which is statistically the mother and the children. And then I'll go into the post-separation shared parenting arrangements and the problems that that can cause, and finally a summary. So first off, revisiting conversational control, verbal abuse, and emotional abuse. Now, we've already had a look at this particular slide in a previous video, but conversational control is central to the whole pattern of coercive control. It means that the coercive controller will dominate the structure of the conversation, whether it will happen, how it will happen, on what topic will it be about, and whether there'll be any conclusion to the conversation that is satisfactory and brings about some resolution. So a conversational control is really about not letting a conversation go anywhere except where the coercive controller wants it to go. They don't let you have your conversational rights. They don't let you experience any conversational manners from the coercive controller. They will not show any conversational manners, and you won't be able to have conversational equality. So that means you don't have the same voice or the same agency, and all of that can happen without including verbal abuse or emotional abuse. It's at the very core. And there are some coercive controllers who are so clever that they can actually control conversations without there ever being very much verbal or emotional abuse. Now, verbal abuse is where the conversation includes words and language that put you down in some way. It affects your self-esteem. It's insulting you, criticizing you, humiliating you. It's calling you names. And that's actually verbal abuse. So conversational control is like the first level and its core. Then the coercive controller might also use some verbal abuse, which is language and words that put you down. But emotional abuse is more of a pattern of language and behavior that will do a variety of things. It will be designed to make you feel irrelevant, as if you don't matter. It will be used to subjugate you, silence you, hurt you, confuse you, analyze you, humiliate you, trick you, isolate you, define you, defame you, intimidate you, monitor, threaten, control, manipulate, exploit, or limit your freedom. So as you can see, emotional abuse is much more of a pattern. It's more extensive. It includes verbal abuse and it includes conversational control. But then if we go further, then I want to take you into discussing psychological abuse, which is almost like a part of emotional abuse, and it's sometimes talked about as the same thing. It depends which research you read. Some research around the world will describe psychological and emotional abuse as the same. There are other experts and researchers who decide that they're two very different things. So I'm just going to make a suggestion to you. One way to understand psychological and emotional abuse and coercive control is like this. If we look at the central attitudinal style, and we have the superior, entitled, and adversarial attitudinal style. I'm a coercive controller. That means that in an intimate relationship, I will subject you to a superior, entitled, and adversarial attitudinal style. I will work to gain and maintain control over your perceptions, your memory, and your reality. I devalue you and I don't treat you as an equal. I attack your thinking and I will distort your reality to make you more convenient and amenable. I can do it quite nicely, such as by explaining that your memory is incorrect or simply denying your reality totally. This is psychologically dominating, it's oppressive, and it's psychologically subjugating of you. I am always right and I aim to win. That attitudinal style is not interested, nor do they place any value on your point of view or your perspective. So the core of coercive control is an attitudinal style that is psychologically dominating, and this can be called psychological abuse. So let's have a look at this. You've got psychological abuse at the core. Now that's the distorting of your reality and your perceptions for their own benefit. And it's just by having that superior, entitled and and adversarial attitudinal style. Just by having that is psychologically dominating of you. It is saying, I'm your boss. I own you. You look to me for direction. Don't look to yourself or anybody else. I will tell you what's true, what's right, what's correct, and what's incorrect. I will tell you what to think. I will tell you who you are. That is psychologically dominating, and it's psychologically abusive. Emotional abuse is more how that is enacted out. So emotional abuse starts with, I control the conversations and will verbally abuse you from time to time. I keep you feeling either fear, obligation, guilt, or shame, and all of this is emotional abuse. I offer you no true emotional safety and intimacy, just intensity and drama. In other words, you can't raise things with me because I'm just going to go off my head possibly, or I will react to you in some way that you wish you'd never raised it if it's inconvenient to me. You are not emotionally safe with me. I confuse you by being intermittently and inconsistently kind, so you never know where you stand, and you love it when I do that, and I can keep you hooked and confused by just bringing in the occasional kindness. I have no empathy for the situations that I put you in, so I can put you in really tricky situations where you are definitely coming off second best. I'm not so worried about that at all. I will retaliate and punish you for standing up to me. So these are all the parts of emotional abuse. I expect you to accept and adhere to a maze of double standards in every area of the relationship. They are there if you look for them. I place you in a maze of complex double binds that you can't see, let alone solve. They are absolute no-wins, and my emotional abuse of you will do that. I violate your boundaries by either ignoring, obstructing, or overpowering you. It's emotional abuse. I violate your rights by either ignoring, obstructing, or overpowering you. That's emotional abuse. So it's very hard to actually tease apart psychological and emotional abuse because, as you can see, they bleed into one another. And one sentence can have conversational control, psychological abuse, and emotional abuse within it. And in some ways, it's almost unnecessary to kind of separate them. But psychological abuse is really a sense of, I'm superior to you. I can distort your reality. I can play games with you. I can make you feel like you're going crazy because I'm better and I have a better grip on reality than you do. And emotional abuse is refusing to meet any of your normal emotional needs in a relationship. So that's just one way, hopefully, that could be helpful to look at it in coercive control. Now, coming up is Luke and Ryan, who are two children who are now old enough to explain what it was like for them living with coercive control. Take a listen to this.
There are calls for a major campaign to raise awareness of coercive control following the case of Lance Hart, who shot and killed his wife Claire and daughter Charlotte after he'd inflicted years of psychological abuse.
Lance Hart also took his own life on that day in July 2016. We can talk now to the family's surviving sons, Luke and Ryan. Good morning, to you both. I'm going to ask, first of all, how are you?
We're actually doing quite well. We've been quite busy raising awareness this week, so quite tired, but it's been a productive week.
And Luke, why do you think, I mean, you have such a powerful story to tell. Why do you think it is important to tell this now, because for 3 years, I think 3 years ago, the laws on coercive control were introduced, and that was the case of you and your family.
That's right. So we had actually only moved our mother and sister away from our father 5 days before he killed them both. We found out on the news app, we both work in different countries, what had happened. And the first thing that struck us was just confusion, because our father had never been violent towards us. And then the violence seemed to come out of nowhere. He seemed to kill our mother and sister out of nowhere, because we'd always thought domestic abuse was about violence. But it's only since we were in the police station in Spalding, we looked up behind us, and 6 months before the coercive control legislation came out, and we saw financial abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, all the other mechanisms our father used to control our family. And at that moment, we realized our father's behavior didn't come out of nowhere. He controlled us our entire lives, and that control had ratcheted up until he killed our mother and sister. And when you consider murder to be the ultimate act of control, suddenly what seemed to come out of nowhere made perfect sense to us. And that's what we're hoping to raise awareness of.
Ryan, one of the things that I know you've talked about already is the notion from the outside looking in, there were no signs effectively as to what was happening within the household. Can you give people a sense of the kind of thing you were witnessing, but maybe didn't realize at the time?
Yeah, so I think what is key is to understand that coercive control isn't so much what is done to you, but what you cannot do yourself. So our father slowly took away our freedoms. So for one, he kept us financially poor. He wasted and gambled money, so we had no money to spend. And he used that as an excuse why we couldn't go and see friends, why we couldn't take part in sports. And over time, we ended up restricting our own social lives because we felt we couldn't actually take part in friendships and society. And over the decades of that slow abuse, we ended up controlling ourselves and limiting our life. And the reason we moved our mum and sister away from the family home wasn't because we were scared our father would kill them, but because we were scared they could never live when they were in the home with him.
And you'd left home by this point?
We had left home, yeah, as Luke said, only 5 days before he killed them. But we found out in the police investigation he was planning on killing all of us for months before we even planned to move out. Because that control over our lives, he could see that slowly disappearing because we were able to provide financially for our mum and our sister.
It's for anyone watching who may be in this situation, and like you two didn't really know you were in a coercive, abusive relationship.
Yeah.
There were little things that happen. I mean, you've mentioned a couple. There was an incident I read about, or a form of routine, your daily tea at 4:15 instead of 4:30. Can you explain
Well,
that?
yeah, so our father almost created a whole system of laws in the house that we had to abide by. And they were designed so we could never meet them. So we always had an excuse to basically just yell at us. So the bus always got in at 4:30, but our father from school, right, and our father always cooked dinner for 4:15. So he either burnt it and then blamed us when we turned up and the food was black, or he'd put it on the plate, ate his, ours was cold, and he would yell at us. And we just couldn't make the bus get there any earlier. But it was those small things where eventually you begin to believe you're the problem because you're always doing something wrong. You're always to blame. All these things are happening that are your fault. And that's what the abuser tells you.
But you were high achievers at school as well, weren't you? You did really well in school. So, and the point being that perhaps teachers, and I'm not passing any criticism onto the education system in this sense, but it wasn't something to look at. You weren't going to be considered as problem children.
Yeah, so that's one key issue we want to raise, is a stereotype of an abuser is not necessarily someone who's violent, who creates those physical scars and bruises. And also, as pupils, we weren't the snapping, like detention pupils. We were overly compliant and quiet and highly successful, not out of determination, but because we were afraid of failure. And that comes from our home environment where we could not fail at home. That wasn't an option. So in our school life, we were those same kids who just got our heads down and worked hard because we had no other option. And I think what is key is we need to change the stereotypes we're looking out for in abusers and also victims. Not all victims are going to be aggressive. They might be if they're responding to physical attacks, but our environment was cultivated over decades. So we slowly accustomed and adapted to be able to survive. And so we became, as you said, overly compliant and fearful. And that made us safe at home. And that necessarily didn't show itself in school in the stereotypical ways.
I mean, you've both been very brave and very honest, and you know the way you tell the story of what happened will be impacting. I just wonder what I'm assuming that a lot of people have responded, have they? Because as you say right at the beginning, you wouldn't know from the outside. If this is happening in a household as it was in yours, you may well not know. These could be the people living next door to you. They could be members of your own family. You just wouldn't know.
And that's the thing, is we lived with a murderer for 25 years and didn't know. The services saw our family, didn't know. Our friends saw our family, didn't know. Because I think when we talk about domestic abuse, we talk about violence, but domestic abuse is about control. Violence is what abusers use to get control. It's a subset of control. And when you take a step back and talk about control, it all makes sense. And I think that's one of the messages we'd like to convey, is that in the media as well, sometimes the media are part of society, they assume abusers are violent men who are angry, who've lost it, and they're violent out of anger and emotion. But our father was cold-blooded, it was calculated, it was based on beliefs and control.
Can I ask one thing, is that if someone is in that circumstance, there will be people listening to this even now thinking, I hear some of the things you're saying correspond with our lives. They might be thinking, what do I do? Do I go and see? I go to the police and I say, do you know what, my dad or whoever it is in the family is stopping us from doing things sometimes. And in their head they might be thinking, it just doesn't sound like much. You know it was an enormous thing, but they might be wary of thinking it just sounds like we're not, you know, what's the problem?
I think we would encourage anyone with any concerns, not only in themselves but in their friends, to call the National Domestic Violence Helpline and just express what you've seen, because by saying it's not that bad, that's what we said our entire lives, it's not that bad. We kept thinking our lives could be worse. And that's not how people should be living, by thinking it could be worse. We all deserve to live freely and happily. And I think if you are seeing some of those elements that we talk about, talk to the experts and raise your concerns, and don't just live and give in to that life that you may have ended up in.
And also one thing in our case is when women leave, that's when they're most likely to be killed by their partners. So we didn't realise. And actually, if you think you're being abused, don't suddenly leave, because that can trigger that loss of control in the men. They feel that you're leaving as a rebuttal to their control, and that can make you in quite danger.
There's a great fear to for anyone who is watching who wants to make their situation known of the consequences, but also life after. How long has it taken for you to kind of get to this very composed and compassionate place?
So I think what was key for us was when we lost Mum and Charlotte, we lost our purpose in life. And it wasn't until we started speaking out about a year and a half after the murders that we started to find new meaning. And we started to, I guess, make something good out of what happened. We didn't.
Quite an extraordinary video clip from Luke and Ryan. They describe from the point of view of children that they didn't even really understand what they were a part of. No one would have seen their family life as full of abuse or violence. School wouldn't have picked it up because, as they said, it was not the stereotypical idea of family violence or domestic violence or even coercive control, because it was cold, calculated, methodical control that they just didn't really know any different from. So moving on to the legacy of coercive control for the non-offending parent, which is statistically the mother and the children. So let's just start at the very beginning. We have the attitudinal style bleeding out into the entire relationship, creating all these effects for the partner of the coercive controller. And we're assuming for this video that it is a woman. Can happen to any gender, but when it comes to post-separation, it is mother and children who are greatly at risk from post-separation coercive control. Now, we've got an awful lot of effects of the dynamics of coercive control there, that a woman, when she is either left or flees or leaves in a planned or unplanned manner from the coercive controller, they've also got all of these effects: the loss of status and reputation, the loss of their parenting rights, voice and agenda, emotional and sexual intimacy, safety and autonomy, economic security, sexually transmitted debt, inability to thrive, loss of life chances, education, work and opportunities, loss of social resources, friends, community and hobbies. And as well as that, the loss is implicit in being denied equality, autonomy, agency, reciprocity, and accountability. That just in itself explains what many women, after ending a relationship one way or the other with a coercive controller, has got going for her. So post-separation, women have to restore their physical health, well-being, safety and autonomy. They have to restore their sexual respect, sexual equality, safety and autonomy. They have to restore their economic independence and security and provide for the children. They have to restore their relationship with themselves, their children, their friends, their family, renew their skills and recreate a social network. They have to restore their voice and agency, and they have to restore their reputation with others and often with their own children. So here we are again. We've got the post-separation legacy of coercive control. We have at the beginning, in the middle, at the beginning, we have the superior, entitled and adversarial attitudinal style, which I call psychological abuse. Psychological domination, subjugation, psychological oppression. It's psychologically abusive. It creates an emotionally abusive behavioural style, which may include, it will definitely include conversational control and verbal abuse, and it hangs off all those dynamics that we've been through so many times. But what happens post-separation is that in the conversations and communications, pre-separation experienced loss of voice and agency. A woman will have experienced a loss of voice and agency in the relationship, and post-separation, she'll still have to deal with an adversarial, blaming and defaming conversational style, with threatening, intimidating, withholding conversation regarding any issue or the children, using social media, litigation, and forcing and controlling conversations against her will. So they are common experiences of women post-separation. And in the social arrangements, the pre-separation, a woman would have experienced a loss of social resources and capital. But post-separation, she also experiences interference in the network with defamation, being economically and physically withheld of any support for the children, refusing to honour childcare needs, not having the money to engage in social things, hampering her ability to work and to create new networks and new relationships, and tracking her, monitoring her, stalking her, surveilling her, using social media and technology to keep on top of what's happening in her life and to make sure she knows he's still there. Again, finances, pre-separation, a woman will experience a loss of security and financial resources. Post-separation, she'll also experience invariably exploitation, including incurring of her ex-partner's debt, economic over-responsibility for the children, deception, obstruction around financial separation and maintenance issues, and obstruction of trying to get housing for herself and work. Now, in the area of the sexual relationship, obviously post-separation, you would think that there was no sexual relationship, but actually what happens, because a coercive controller invariably feels like they own their partner sexually, they do treat her sexually post-separation as well. So pre-separation, a woman is going to be experiencing a sense of being owned and controlled and a loss of intimacy and reciprocity. Post-separation, a woman will experience sexually demeaning attitudes, comments, the blocking of her new relationship, maybe sexual assault and rape. So many of our clients have been sexually assaulted and raped post-separation, even on the night that they're wanting to leave, leading up to wanting to leave. It's not well talked about. It's not well understood just how much sexual assault can go on in a way that's not even necessarily chargeable, because a coercive controller knows how to do that without being charged. Public portrayal. Pre-separation, a woman is going to experience defamation invariably, and loss of social validation, reputation, and support. Again, it all depends upon the style of the coercive controller, how much defamation a woman will experience. Post-separation, she'll experience inaccurate representation to significant others, such as in litigation, court, counselling, mediation for family, friends, children, professionals, and judiciary. She'll be invariably called an unfit mother, causing trouble, questionable character, and maybe mentally unwell. These are all very common post-separation experiences for women after ending a relationship with a coercive controller. And finally, in their physical safety, prior to breaking up, they lost their safety and autonomy. Pre-separation, there was a constant disregard for their safety, autonomy, health, or well-being of themselves or the family. Post-separation, there's also invariably a disregard for safety, autonomy, health, and well-being of the parent or the child, the use of threats, harassment, stalking, assault, kidnapping, and possibly murder. So that's a post-separation legacy of coercive control. Now, every woman will experience to some degree elements of that. It will depend upon how much support she's got post-separation and what kind of coercive controller her ex-partner was or is. So here's some examples that come out of my research and from our clients. So again, we've got the psychological abuse or the attitudinal style bleeding through the entire relationship, which includes emotional abuse, and it comes out in the conversations and communications like this. This is what they say. It was no different to pre-separation. He would range from self-pity, poor me, look what you've done to me, to flat-out spite and anger, blame, always blame, sarcasm, put-downs, name-calling, everything to avoid resolution. In the social arrangements, he would do drive-bys. He had his eye on us. I was stranded by him. Everyone either avoided me or thought I was strange. I felt like an alien. I'd lost all my skills. I wasn't sure who I was, and he was so well connected. I'd say he went round every real estate agent and told them I was no good. I can't tell people what it's like every time he has contact with the kids and how worrying that is for me. The financial arrangements. He said to me, you're not worth the money and you'll be lucky if you get anything. You'll be out there on the road with nothing. He tried all sorts of games with the property settlement. I lost my financial settlement because I told my ex I'm frightened that our son will suffer if I don't give in to you. And he said, yes, he will. He would call out things like saggy tits. He would look me up and down the wrong way, disrespectfully. He paid someone to put acid on my new boyfriend's car. He still tells people I am a frigid bitch. He came back and raped me. He poisoned the kids against me. I'd made the kids unhappy, him unhappy, and I'd made his mother sick in the guts. And I was a bitch because I'd spent his money and I was sitting pretty. He went round to everybody, even to the school counsellor, blaming and ridiculing me. Post-separation defamation. He'd come up and bang on the doors, yell and scream, phone all the time, wait outside work. He didn't look after the kids properly. He'd bring them back dirty, wet, unhappy, too much sugar. I feared for their safety and for mine. I wasn't there to protect them. So these are just examples of what's possible in each post-separation version of a pre-separation coercive control pattern. That's the post-separation version. It continues. It just carries on regardless of the separation. So when we say to women, why do you stay? Why don't you leave? We are disregarding that the coercive control just continues post-separation, and it can gather moss, it can gather momentum if the coercive control is aided and abetted and colluded with, and quite often they are. Professor Evan Stark.
Domestic violence was the leading context in which children were abused. Our research way back was the first, I think, to show the concurrence of domestic violence and child abuse. We found in 45% of the cases of child abuse, the mother was battered and the primary offender, hurting both the mother and the child, was the male partner. At the time, everybody thought, all the research was focused on mothers as the primarily responsible for abuse. There was no official recognition of domestic violence. All of it was attributed to behavioral problems, alcohol, mental health, poverty, or a woman's cognitive deficits. You know, she was slow and what have you. So this was revolutionary. And so for 3 decades, we focused on the effects of violence on children, primarily looking at exposure and witnessing, as well as direct physical abuse. We also looked at the effects of domestic violence on parenting, how the batterer interfered with the parenting in terms of discipline practices, how children were affected indirectly when the mother took to alcohol or drugs to mediate the abuse that she was experiencing, to modify the stress. Then, lo and behold, as we've already mentioned, we recognized that not only was the violence model, the model which identified partner abuse with individual assaults, inadequate, and had to be replaced by the much more, I think, accurate picture of most abuse that women experience as coercive control. But we also had to rethink the idea that it was exposure to violence and the resultant trauma, either because of direct violence against the child or witnessing a primary parent hurt, that explained the negative outcomes for children. And so as I began to interview children and began to look at the research of Emma Katz and others, which was based on my work, but went way beyond it by looking at the qualitative effects of coercive control on children, it really became clear to me first that children were being coercively controlled as well as women. The same tactical patterns were being used with children. In other words, when we looked at the pattern of child abuse of children, it wasn't what was anticipated by Child Protective Services, the injury that a visiting nurse could detect or that would be reported by a neighbor or a parent. The vast majority of the physical abuse of children, which was frequent, by the way, in abusive homes by the abuser, were low-level assaults, just as they were for women. The same thing was true for sexual assaults. That is, there was sexual assault of children, some of it dramatic, but again, most of it fell on a continuum of sexual coercion, touching, inappropriate, dressing, depending on the age of the child. Boys, by the way, as well as girls, but primarily female children, were beginning to experience a range of sexual abuse, along with the violence, very much in the same ways that women were. When it came to isolation, intimidation, and some of the other elements, it was much more difficult to document this. But through my interviews, and now with some researchers like Emma Katz looking at particularly isolation, we're beginning to see that children are experiencing the same patterns of isolation, intimidation, and control. And moreover, many of the effects that we attributed to violence up to now are actually due to other elements of the abuse. And because we were only looking, because our violence model told us to look in that way, at certain kinds of outcomes, particularly those associated with trauma, we missed a whole set of outcomes. A good example would be the fact that when rigid gender roles are imposed upon children, boys and girls in a home, the same rigidity that the partner is imposing on his wife or girlfriend at home are imposed on children, the children's school performance suffers dramatically because they lack the flexibility to adapt to the requirements of complex social relationships and education, you see.
So we're moving now into post-separation shared parenting arrangements, and this is where we come into the research such as just described by Stark, and has also been described by the experiences of Luke and Ryan, of just how careful we have to be as a society about allowing a coercive controller to parent post-separation without actually discovering whether that coercive controller actually has the capacity to parent, whether they are understanding of the children's needs. It goes beyond having the children because the children are his children and he expects to have time with them, but is he able to actually parent those children in a way that isn't going to cause additional harm to them that's already been done? So post-separation shared parenting arrangements generally bring around an enormous amount of debate. They're very contentious, and there are so many researchers now who are trying to throw light on it. But one thing is for certain, and I mentioned this last week, I think, there's a very disturbing double bind and a societal contradiction around these, and that is that prior to separation, professionals and other community members may be harshly critical of a mother whom they perceive as guilty of failing to protect her children from exposure to a batterer. Yet, after separation, the same people get suspicious of her motives for attempting to protect her children and may attribute children's symptoms to the mother's alleged anxiety, overprotectiveness, or vindictiveness against the alleged abuser. Bancroft, Silverman and Ritchie, 2012. My own research is a PhD on the legacy of domestic violence and how the dynamics of abuse continue beyond separation. I interviewed 30 women with children in Tasmania who were either in the middle of post-separation shared parenting arrangements or had them. And these are the main findings. The mothering role, they felt, was reduced to revolving around and compensating for the type of fathering role their ex-partner wanted to take. Women and children experience a wide variation in paternal time. If the non-resident father fails to maintain contact with his children, there are no consequences, yet the mother's fear of contact attracts condemnation and negative consequences. The women felt forced to accommodate their partners at the expense of themselves and their children's rights, health, and well-being. There was a lack of legal recourse for mothers whose ex-partners were intermittently or constantly neglectful of their children's needs or paternal time. There was no requirements for accountability by the father as to the patterns of previous contact or conduct with the children or towards their mother. The women describe legal support for their ex-partners' parenting rights, but a total minimisation of their own concerns and rights, minimisation of the ex-partners of the abuse and control, a focus on the father's rights to contact and the apparent needs of the children for contact, but ignoring his parenting capacity. So there were some post-separation double standards. There was a denial of reciprocity. Women were expected to provide, adapt, adjust, and accommodate, as well as take up the slack for father's parenting. Now that is a double standard. It's not the other way around. It was the women who were expected to do that. Father's rights to contact were privileged over mother's concerns. There was an uncritical assumption that children's contact with both parents was necessary. The mothers found themselves blamed by their ex-partners and professionals or judiciary for all post-separation problems with communication and children's problems, irrespective of father's behaviour. A greater focus on the possibility of the mother alienating the children from the father than on the father's behaviour and parenting capacity and how he was affecting the children and relating to them. A minimisation and denial of the extent of the abuse and violence, blaming the victim and explaining away violence as a reciprocal process was experienced by the women legally, socially and professionally. The layers of threat endured by the women from their ex-partners was taken far less seriously than the threat to fathers of a loss, reduction or strict management of contact with the children. And there were several double binds. There was a baseline of fear and high alert for women, as well as an overload of responsibility. So to be frightened and feeling under threat and also having most of the responsibility for the children was a real double bind. There was no way out of that. Being accused of alienating the children from the father if they try to protect the children, or being accused of failure to protect the children if they didn't. Unable to depend on the ex-partner for appropriate parenting input or discussion, yet required to answer to him regarding the children is a revolve around me but don't depend on me double bind. It's not fair to actually have to revolve around your ex-partner but be unable to depend on them for any proper parental input. Despite having to compromise for paternal time and the degree of responsibility taken for the children, the women's efforts were invariably devalued by their ex-partners anyway. So coming up now is Sadie's story. There's just a video clip from this, from the Child and Family Community Australia, which talks about research on post-separation issues for women.
The mothers in the sample told us that they and their children continued to be exposed to domestic and family violence, where they continued to have contact with the perpetrator, sometimes as a result of ongoing parenting arrangements. In these circumstances, children continued to be exposed to poor parenting by the ex-partner, including abusive behaviours. One of the interesting findings from the interview data concerned fathers' abuse of service systems. 29 of the 50 women reported to us that they experienced systems abuse after separation. They reported that they had to engage with multiple systems and services, and that at times perpetrators exploited the inconsistencies between these systems and services. Perpetrators engaged in manipulative engagement or non-engagement with services and systems to exhaust the personal and financial resources of women, including their allocations of legal aid. This manipulative engagement included making counter-allegations in proceedings for personal protection orders and in parenting processes and in mediation. It included non-compliance with court orders and with child support obligations, and it was linked in some cases, such as Sadie's, to some mothers losing contact with children or becoming the non-resident carer on a permanent or temporary basis. So if we think about Sadie's story, we can see that it demonstrates the dramatic impact of financial violence on financial stability, despite the fact that Sadie had been the breadwinner for her family and maintained 2 jobs prior to separation. She ultimately became homeless and unemployed, despite trying to keep her foot in the workforce and support her family for as long as possible. This had a domino effect for her capacity to be the viable carer for her daughter. Despite the violence and abuse, her daughter remained with the father because he had a roof over his head.
So there lies some more of the post-separation legacy of family violence and coercive control. is that for Sadie, she was overwhelmed by it, lost custody of her child. Her child lives with the father, despite the father being abusive and violent. And there are too many stories like that. It's like post-separation, what happened pre-separation is not taken enough into account for the safety and well-being of the mother and the children post-separation. If coercive control is not a crime, then the message we're sending to those victimised by it, including the children, is that it is up to them to manage the control, the abuse, and the violence themselves. So here's some research. I'm just going to highlight some of the most important bits. There is so much important research coming out now in the last few years. Like this research came out in 2016. And the main premise is that it is concluded that in court proceedings, the reality of living with coercively controlling violence and the potential ongoing risks it poses to children and non-abusive parents is typically negated. Instead, best interests considerations prioritise the maintenance of perpetrator-child relationships and thus abusers' rights over victim safety. In 2016, Leslie Lang is a well-known post-separation family violence researcher, having written numerous books on the subject. She writes that core themes in the women's narratives of engagement with the family law system was silencing, control, and undermining the mother-child relationship, mirrored domestic violence dynamics, suggesting the concept of secondary victimization as a useful lens for understanding their experiences. So there is much research that explains the post-separation experiences of women and children is secondary victimizing, or a secondary victimization of them after being victimized in the relationship by the coercive controller. Then they get victimized by the legal system post-separation. And this research in 2017, this article explores how women's engagement with the legal system is frequently experienced as an extension of an intimate partner's coercive control. It builds on existing research showing how legal processes provide an opportunity for perpetrators to continue and even expand their repertoire of coercive and controlling behaviours post-separation. I refer to this as legal systems abuse. Now, all these articles are Australian. And lastly, 5th of June 2020. Firstly, that women demonstrated a mode of protecting rather than parenting, indicating that mothering was often undertaken in isolation and fear within an adversarial family law system and in the presence of a perpetrator of family violence. The second theme related to the aftermath of separation and the long dark shadow cast by family violence. After having left a controlling and violent relationship, separated mothers reported that there was no opportunity to recover nor to healthily extricate themselves from family violence, which resulted in cumulative harm, not only for their well-being, but also for their children. And we're coming up to our summary. Coercive control sets women up for a host of unfair post-separation challenges and obstacles. Whilst she is trying to reconfigure her life, her ex-partner invariably continues a post-separation version of coercive control, particularly around the children and post-separation shared parenting arrangements. There are many layers of threat to her post-separation equality, autonomy, and agency in her life. Children experience pre- and post-separation coercive control as well. Plus, they are affected by different levels and types of impact on their mother and their siblings. Coercive control does not allow pre- or post-separation equality, autonomy, or agency for women and children. We must address this in post-separation professional and legal services, or we are colluding with inequality and oppression. So thank you for watching and listening to this video. Stay tuned for next Thursday's Thoughtcast, Transforming and Healing from Coercive Control. I hope that you've got something out of this video. Post-separation challenges when in the context of coercive control is a very, very difficult issue to talk about. It's highly emotional, it's so contentious, and yet it really must be addressed, and the more that we understand about it, the better. Thank you for listening. See you next week. Bye-bye.